Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. On this Monday, it is the 21st day of August in the year 2017. It is also Eclipse Day, and I think the reason we're starting 7 minutes late may have something to do with the eclipse, because we just couldn't seem to connect through Skype at all. Finally, we were able to. Bob tried a number of different things, but we've been playing with this thing for 10 minutes. Trying to get connections and calling each other on different phones and at different numbers and various other things. And somehow we finally did something right, at least for the moment. So we're on the air. I assume we'll stay on the air. I do hope so. But anyway, belated though it is, welcome to this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is, of course, a very special Monday. It's a little bit ironic when you follow the news on this. Millions of people are taking to the roads, crowding into hotels in places like Nashville and other places which are supposed to have the best view of the eclipse when it happens. And I believe the maximum where we are should be around 2:30 this afternoon, about 30 minutes before we go off the air. So I guess that it's going to get pretty dark during that period. Now, what that'll mean in terms of our signal and our connections, we don't know. But we'll give it a go and try as best we can. It's kind of interesting because though millions of people are on the road going to various places, South Carolina and Nashville and various other places, the hotels in Nashville are jammed from what the CBS News reported earlier this morning. But then the fact of the matter is they tell you that you shouldn't look at it and be very careful about the special glasses that are out there and available for watching the eclipse, since many of them are bogus and don't work and could hurt your eyes. So the fact of the matter is it's an event that millions of people are excited about and preparing for, and the ultimate suggestion is don't watch it. So, but be that as it may, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But on the other hand, it makes as much sense as a number of other things that continue to happen and have happened in recent days and recent weeks. We look forward to hearing from you. I presume that our phone number would work if you would like to come on the air and join me in a short conversation and share some thoughts and ideas with our other listeners. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I do have an email address, and I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And I do call your attention to our Facebook page, and I do want to spend a little bit of time in today's program talking a little bit about what's on the Facebook page, because I put two postings on there this weekend that are related to the history class that I'm teaching at West Virginia Tech. And I flagged those particular items. And I had an experience in class this morning that I will share with you as long as we're talking about Facebook. I had a young lady that is in my class came up at the end of class to tell me she's not on Facebook. And I was pleasantly stunned. And I thought, oh, finally there's somebody that isn't. I was thinking to myself, but I didn't say that. And of course, what she was saying is, since I don't use Facebook, I can't get the posting. Well, the fact of the matter is you can. You don't have to have your own Facebook page or be a regular contributor to Facebook to to read what's on there, I don't believe. I think that anybody can go on there and just type facebook.com and then go to the search box and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you would have access to the postings that are on that Facebook page. It would be, I don't know that you would be able to react to it or engage in any kind of interaction with the Facebook page if you're not a user of Facebook. I can't, to tell you the truth, I'm not really sure. But anyway, I wanted to let you know that there is a young woman in southern West Virginia, about 20, 21 years old, I presume, that's not on Facebook. And I think it may be in silence because I wouldn't want to embarrass her in front of her classmates. But I think we ought to, in silence, celebrate the fact that Facebook hasn't totally engulfed or grabbed everybody. But it should grab the president, as we know, and we continue to find out as more and more information comes in on last November's elections. I'll get to that, probably not today, but in a future program, maybe one this week. There was an article that appeared some weeks ago, a follow-up on the president's campaign, and especially the role that Facebook played in it. And I've had it, here ready to go with it for a number of actually weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, and haven't gotten to it yet. But it's still there, and it's well worth the time that I'd like to devote to it at a future time. But there's so many things that are happening. It seems to me that you never get to these things. I think since last time we were together, we kind of lost Steve Bannon from the White House, and a lot of the reaction over the weekend has been in response to Bannon's leaving the White House on Friday. And again, it appears that Steve Bannon resigned from his position as special advisor or counsel to the president. But the word is, of course, that it never appears to be what it really is, and the word was that the president has asked him to resign, principally, as part of the reaction to the flap that occurred over the Confederate statue coming down last weekend in Charlottesville, and the violence that ensued. And of course, there was a lot of media coverage from Boston on Saturday about the anti-racist protests. And in Boston, something in the area of 40,000 people gathered downtown in and around the Boston Common in response to a planned, permitted free speech march or demonstration from white supremacists. And to be honest with you, the counter-protest was so well attended, there were so many people there, and got so much attention, that it's a little bit difficult to find out whether, in fact, the white supremacist march actually happened. If it did, it didn't get much media attention. The opposition to it did. And I think a lot of people are encouraged by that. But it seems to me that the news of the day continues to be in many ways quite amazing. The exit of Steve Bannon and Bannon's comment, first of all, his return after his resignation to Breitbart, and the fact that he chaired a board meeting at Breitbart Friday evening, I believe, late Friday afternoon, after his exit from the White House. And he vowed to basically take up the campaign that he had been on as director and head of Breitbart before he accepted the post at the White House. And his response was that now he's free, and he's free to take on the opponents of President Trump the way he really wants to, and his hands aren't tied behind his back by the president and the advisors to the president and all the rest of it. And it seems to me we're entering yet a different phase, the next phase, as it were, of a situation or a controversy that continues to go on and on and on. I think one of the things that I noted just to myself, I didn't post it anywhere or say anything officially to anybody about it. But it's obvious to me that the president's pattern of making news on Fridays in order to make sure that he or his agenda dominates the news on over the weekend, I think is continuing to happen as it's been happening for a number of weeks. Fridays seem to be a big day in Washington. Well, I shouldn't say in Washington because the president hasn't been in Washington for 2 weeks until today. But the president's ability to manipulate, control media, it seems to me, is a fascinating situation to watch. And in spite of the fact that in many ways, when it comes to politics, President Trump, many people point out, is a novice and is making mistakes and errors and policy mistakes and a number of other things because he really doesn't know his way around Washington, his lay of the political land and all the rest of it. The fact of the matter is one has to at least admire a little bit the man's ability to control the media and to dominate the news. So again, there's quite a bit going on. What the reaction is going to be to the exit of Steve Bannon is a little bit unclear at this point. I think that there are a few reactions or outcomes, if you will, to the whole situation over the last week that I think are significant. They're not getting a lot of attention because they're not that pronounced, but they're there just as well. One of the things that becomes very clear that I think it's worth noting, what it might mean long term, is a little bit difficult to determine. But one of the things, excuse me for a moment. I'm just looking as a phone call coming in on the other phone, but I'm not going to bother taking it. One of the things that I think has occurred is that the situation in the White House has obviously been traumatic to a point. And it's been an issue. It's been on the news, getting quite a bit of coverage. The fact of the matter is, much that's happening in the White House is becoming less and less available to the general public. The White House is becoming more and more secretive behind closed doors in the way it operates. There's an editorial in today's New York Times, for example, which speaks to just one facet of this. And I will mention it. And it's the idea of the log, the regular log that is kept of visitors to the White House. Under President Obama, for example, this log was public information. And what that meant was that anybody that wanted to know could gain access to who was going in and out of the White House on a regular basis, whether it was to visit or see the president, or whether it was to see a member or members of his staff, or to pursue a particular issue, whatever it happened to be, the information was public. And what that meant was it was fairly easy to determine exactly who was involved, who had the president's ear, if you will, who was there. And from that, you could pretty well get some sense as to what the issues were and what matters were seemingly getting priority attention. There were a lot of conclusions or insights that one could draw from the visitors list. The Trump administration has pretty well taken that list away from public access. It has kind of a, rather mundane excuse about the president's intention to separate the information on the political side of visitors coming to the White House as opposed to the emphasis on the personal side. The president's argument is, who comes and goes to visit me or members of my family on personal matters or on personal business is nobody business but ours. And so that ought to be separated from what's made available to the general public. And then the next step in that process is to point out how difficult it is to separate those things. And the result is that because it's so difficult to separate them, the White House has stopped trying. And it's just basically closed the book on the whole procedure. So now it's almost impossible to get a sense of who's coming and going, who's there and not there on a regular basis. So we don't know who's speaking to the president on what issues, who's getting the most attention, who the president seems to be listening to the most, who he may be listening to less. Many things that traditionally have been included in a category of kind of important things to know or important insights to have are now gone. I think all of us know that the president is scheduled to address the nation this evening on Afghanistan. And the reports are that there's going to be a troop increase in Afghanistan, that President Trump and his advisors have met this weekend and have basically decided on a strategy to move forward with the war in Afghanistan, a war which has not been going well. And supposedly, from what we're hearing, the administration has made the decision to increase the troop strength in Afghanistan and make an effort to turn the situation there around. And the president is going to address the nation this evening, I believe at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, on that particular issue. What makes that significant is that this is really the first time in a long time that the president has spoken to the nation, so to speak, other than his rallies, which are covered by the media and these other things. But less and less access to this president is one of the themes that we're seeing over the last couple of weeks. It's obviously an issue that's being talked about the efforts of the advisors around the president to rein him in a little bit, get a little bit more control over what he says and what he does. But the fact of the matter is, as long as he has that Twitter account, what he puts on there, we just kind of have to wait and see. There doesn't seem to be any way to stop him from taking that in his own hands and generating media copy and media attention through Twitter. But again, the fallout from the Charlottesville situation has been absolutely incredible over the last week. Has been as well the fallout over the latest violence in Spain, and the president's reaction to that. More and more, we're hearing reports about the president's competence. Senator Corker of Tennessee, you may recall it toward the end of last week, spoke on this particular issue. And it's pointed out that Corker is not just a member of the United States Senate. He's a particularly significant member of the United States Senate. He's chair, I believe, of the Armed Services Committee. He's been a major supporter of and confidant for President Trump. In fact, Senator Corker was in the running for the Secretary of State's position that Rex Tillerson finally received. So this is one of President Trump's closest advisors and supporters, making rather lengthy comments about the president's inability up to this point to act presidential or to give any sense of confidence that he's able to embrace or become the kind of president that the nation needs. He doesn't seem to have the temperament. He doesn't seem to be able to control his temper. He doesn't seem to be swayed by the number of historical facts and errors that he makes on a regular basis. He doesn't, according to Corker, at least up to this point, reveal any of the degree of competence necessary to be president of the United States. And it's been 8 months. The administration is 8 months into the first year. So we're moving toward the end of the first year, which would be 25% of a 4-year administration. And so far, we haven't seen any significant pieces of legislation. And I think, as I've said before here on the Virtual Center, given what this legislation would be intended to do, my personal feeling is it's a good thing a lot of it hasn't passed. But the fact of the matter is, if you connect leadership with the ability to get things done, it's just not happening. And the fact of the matter is, prominent Republicans are distancing themselves from the president. Business, last week, in the dissolution of the 2 business councils, is to a large extent distancing itself from President Trump. And that particular situation drew reaction on Wall Street with the first major drop in the Dow Jones average, well over 200 points one day toward the end of last week. So the situation in the administration is traumatic. And it's a little bit to get a handle on exactly what direction it's going in or where we're going. But it's not giving many of us much more comfort than it gave us before. If anything has changed in the last several months, is that there are more voices from more different perspectives and places that are raising serious questions about what's going on and what's not going on. And at the same time, we have these international situations which are causing serious questions in the minds of many people and raising serious issues, the North Korean situation being the most obvious. But there are others. One of them is going to be the need to increase the debt ceiling in order to keep the government operative after, I believe, the end of September. I believe it's the end of September. Maybe it's the beginning of September. I'm not really sure. But the question is, there, in the minds of many people, there seems to be the probability or the possibility of a shutdown. And what that might mean. And all of these things are up in the air at this point. So I think a lot has happened since the last time that we were together here at the Virtual Center, which was 5 days ago. And so I guess the bottom line that for me would be stay tuned. I mentioned our Facebook page at the very beginning of the program today. And I mentioned that I wanted to go back and make a comment or two about Facebook. And as I mentioned last week, with the beginning of a class that I'm teaching, I've taken to posting documents pertinent to this particular course on our Facebook page. And I'd made it very clear that I would flag these postings by tagging them with the WVU Tech History 152 label, which would alert students in my class that these documents or these postings were specifically for them. And it would also alert other users of the Virtual Center Facebook page that these particular things are pertinent directly to the class that I'm teaching. The fact is, I'm getting a lot of reaction to the things that I've put on the Facebook page, even though they aren't necessarily related to the issues that we're covering here at the Virtual Center. They're much more connected to the class I'm teaching, which makes sense. It's only the first few days. Today was the third meeting of the class, effectively the end of the first week of meetings with 15 weeks to go. So what we're looking at is the possibility of something like 42 or 43 meetings of this particular class between now and the end of the session. And I'm getting a lot of reaction to the postings that are on there. And at this point, since my class is very large, I have near 80 students in the class. It's a little bit difficult for me to determine whether the reactions I'm getting are from regular listeners of the program, of this program, or whether in fact they're from students in the class. I'm not familiar enough with the names yet to be able to determine that at this point. But I thought, and I expected when I took on the issue of the challenge of teaching this class, that an awful lot of what I would be doing would become issues to talk about and share with you here on our Virtual Center meetings and programs. And indeed, that's pretty much happening. As we begin this course, and it's the very beginning course, the first semester, if you will, in the survey course on American history, it's the course that begins with the nature of the world up until the end of the 15th century, 1492, Christopher Columbus's voyage. And the beginning of American history, it seems, begins with the voyages of Columbus and various other explorers who are sailing under the flag of different nation states in Europe. And the first major issue that I think is worthy of focusing on for these students, many of them beginning students in college, is to get some idea of what Western civilization is like. What makes it tick? How is it organized? What are its priorities? In other words, to get some sense as to what the key ingredients of the modern world are all about. And what makes this particular period in a history course so significant is that it seems to me the best way to begin a course like this is to introduce to students to some idea of what Europe was like during the medieval period and what kinds of changes occurred, and I'm suggesting had to occur, before you can understand the series of events which led to the peopling of Britain's 13 colonies on the east coast of North America. I think this is material that I covered this morning. But one of the things it seems to me we know pretty well is that Europeans were well aware that there were other land masses, other continents, other places out there prior to 1492. In fact, we've got numerous examples and evidences of the degree to which travelers from Western Europe visited portions of the Western Hemisphere long before Columbus. The name that was often used in textbooks in Chapter 1 of numerous textbooks was Leif Erikson. The Norse explorers coming across the northern straits and touching on places like Newfoundland and parts of the Canadian coast, what is now the Canadian coast. So the fact of the matter is, we know that Europeans knew of the existence of something that later we begin to call North America, or the North American, South American archipelago, if you will. But the fact of the matter is, even though Europeans knew of it, they did nothing with it. They seemed not to care about it. It had little, if any, impact on what was happening in Europe. But the fact of the matter is, when Columbus sails in 1492, it sets off a chain of events. It initiates a competitive race among other developing nations to send out explorers of their own. And ultimately produce a wave of what we call colonization. So it seems to me the issue behind all of this are the changes that had occurred in Europe from the earlier period, the medieval period, the Middle Ages, into the beginnings of the modern period, typified by the voyages of Columbus and those who followed him. Basically, then, what we're asking students to spend some time thinking about are the differences between the Middle Ages in Europe and the beginnings of the modern period. What are the major differences or characteristics of the two periods? More importantly, how do these various characteristics connect? How do they help us get our arms around the concept of the modern world? More specifically, the idea of what we call modernization. If you think about it, many textbooks take this particular approach. What are the factors, the key factors in the emergence of modernization, the emergence of the modern world from the medieval world? What are the major contrasts or differences between the two? That's pretty much the theme that I've chosen as a way to begin or to develop this course. And it seems to me it's an important one, because it not only gets us into the emergence of modern nation states, which is one of the major political changes between medieval Europe and the modern period. The emergence of nations, what we call today countries, modern nations, under strong governments, strong kings, monarchs, kings and queens, whatever you want to call it. What had been in the medieval period a disunited, disjointed Europe over the few hundred years before Columbus begins to emerge a degree of political unification, political stability under strong monarchs. And the result of that solidification, the result of that coming together, is the emergence of modern nations. And associated, obviously, with the emergence or the existence of modern nations under strong kings and queens comes stability, comes a semblance of law and order, comes the kind of environment which makes those things we associate with a positive business climate available. One of the major changes that occurs in the transition from medieval to modern Europe is the emergence of a vibrant middle class throughout Europe, a business community, a community of people comprised of investors, bankers, people in insurance, shipbuilders, insurance people, opportunity, investment opportunities. And what we know about business today, what we know about capitalism today, tells us that business seeks stable, predictable environments in order to function. People are unwilling to risk the investment of their wealth in situations that are not stable, in situations that are volatile. Consequently, what that means is there's almost a natural alliance that takes place from the very beginning of the modernization process between the middle classes and government, between government and the business community. Government promises the stability, the law and order, the security, and the predictability that business could get from no other place. That means that business's number one priority is to support government. But if you turn that coin over and look at the other side, if you look at it from the other perspective, government needs the middle classes as well. Because government's number one priority is to win the trust and the support of its own people. When the people do not support or trust the government's future is at risk. Bottom line, government's power, popularity, and strength is directly contingent on the good faith and the trust and the support that it can build amongst its own population. If people are doing well, if people are optimistic, if people are beginning to think positively about tomorrow rather than just focusing on today, if people are becoming more confident about the future because they believe the government that is in power is giving them the luxury of being able to do that, then the result is that government's power and popularity is enhanced. Increasingly, with the emergence of the middle class, comes the existence of a vibrant business community, a back and forth situation of trading, bartering, the emergence throughout Europe of fairs, which brings people in from all around to sell their wares and exchange them for things that other people have that they might need. Buying and selling becomes a regular practice more and more as a business environment increases. That means that there are opportunities that people begin to see that they had never seen before, and they are inclined to pursue them. The more this happens, the more a business environment begins to engulf Europe, the more the middle classes and the priorities of the middle class begin to dominate Western Europe, the more government begins to realize that its popularity, its future, the level of trust it has, its power is directly connected to the success of the business community. Government begins to realize that by supporting business, it is supporting the kind of growth environment that creates opportunities for people. And the result is that government gets the credit for that, not business, but government. Government gets the blame if things go wrong, but in theory, government gets the credits if things go right. So the result is there's a reciprocal relationship, if you will, between business and government. Government, by definition, is able to establish a monopoly over military power. Governments increasingly use their military power in order to protect the kind of environment that business needs to flourish. And this reciprocal, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours environment becomes more and more popular, more and more present throughout Europe. What we're seeing, of course, is the beginnings of what we know to be capitalism. At this point, it's not industrial capitalism, it's commercial capitalism. It's based on trade, on expansion, on the pursuit of wealth. Business begins to see the opportunities available in overseas investments, in investments in the expansion and exploration of the planet. Overseas exploration and ultimately colonization become key ingredients of a middle class effort to seek and gain control over wealth. Business looks for the kind of security and protection for these ventures that only government can provide. So government's military monopoly becomes a way that government can protect and promote the kind of peaceful, business-friendly environment that investors need and want if they're going to invest their wealth. Their success is the nation's success. Governments become stronger with the influx of wealth from overseas. All of it based on a few basic principles of political power in the modern world. A nation's success and its power is directly related to the degree of wealth that the nation has at its own command. A nation needs resources. It needs water. It needs natural resources. It needs timber. It needs agriculture. It needs commerce. It needs shipbuilding. It needs sailors. It needs exploration for wealth. The more of that wealth that a nation can command, the more powerful it is. John Locke, the economic philosopher that all of us know and have heard of so often, John Locke makes the point, as did Adam Smith in the 18th century, that all of this is based on the premise that the earth's wealth, natural resources, are fixed. At this period, in this period, there's no distinction made between renewable energy and fixed energy. The assumption is that there's only so much wealth out there. And the reality is that every nation, every government must make it a priority to control as much of that wealth as possible. Because that wealth, control of that wealth, translates directly into power. Why? Because if a nation must have certain things, then if the nation can't get its own supply, if the nation is unable to supply itself with the resources it absolutely has to have, then it has no option except to go to other places, other nations that do have those resources and deal for them, bargain for them. The degree to which your nation is dependent on other competitor nations for what it needs is a measure of your nation's dependency. And in the world of nations, dependency is weakness. Independence, self-sufficiency is strength. So by definition, if there's a fixed amount of wealth out there, the more of it you control, the less of it others control. And what that means is you don't have to go to your rivals for things that you need. But in the best of all possible worlds, if you control enough of the world's wealth, they have to come to you, which means you call the shots. You control other nations' access to a particular form of wealth that they have to have, but you control. And that means that to that degree, you control them because they have to have it. For those that remember this, in the 70s, during the oil crisis of the 70s, when OPEC began to organize the shutdown and the control, the reduction in production in order to drive up oil prices throughout the world. Many of us remember the long lines in the 70s. This was the period in which Jimmy Carter sat in the White House. Jimmy Carter had the misfortune to be president of the United States during one of the greatest natural resources disasters that the nation has ever seen. We were, if you remember the term, much too dependent on foreign oil. And our objective had to be to become more sufficient, more self-sufficient in energy. The more we could become self-sufficient, the less dependent we were on potential rivals. But in the 70s, OPEC controlled the shots because they set the prices. The result was we had these long lines at gasoline stations. People were fighting each other. We had lots of examples of road rage and all the rest of it over access to gasoline, access to energy. The greatest military power in the history of the world was being brought to its knees because it didn't have control of sufficient access to oil. Now, as you know, the United States has become an exporter of energy, especially as the world turns increasingly to natural gas. The result is, in theory, that more and more of the world is becoming increasingly dependent on us for its energy needs. And the result is that that ought to translate into American influence and American power. The fact of the matter is there are problems with this situation that didn't used to exist but do now. The information revolution, the internet, the communications revolution, what Thomas Friedman in his earlier book, very famous book called The World is Flat, has indicated that the world has shrunk, that it has become much smaller through the technological revolution that increases communication throughout the world. The result is that as renewable energy becomes more and more available, nations of the world throughout the world are moving in that direction, and it's costing us the kind of influence and power that we would expect our control over fossil fuel energy to give us, because the world is changing. And what disturbs a lot of people is that clearly the United States had the opportunity to take the leadership in renewable energy, in wind energy, and solar energy also. But it appears that President Trump and his cohort of climate deniers have pretty much decided to forego that leadership in terms of what he calls an America First agenda. And that's another issue. All of these issues, it seems to me, are important. And I'm probably insulting the intelligence of the people tuned in to the virtual center today with some of this. But the fact of the matter is, in college, especially beginning college students, a lot of this stuff is information they don't have, especially the connections. None of it is information they haven't heard of. But the chances are quite likely that they haven't been in a position where they had to make the kinds of connections that rendered all of this stuff meaningful. And so that's what I'm asking them to do at the beginning of this course, is put it all together in order to try to get some sense as to what modern Western civilization is all about. Once you understand that, you can begin to understand the relationships that happen after the 15th century, the relationships that unfold between Western civilizations and non-Western civilizations. Nations or peoples that for one reason or another have not had the advantage, if you will, of going through these kinds of modernization changes. The result has been that the West has pretty much been able to dominate world history since this period. A lot of people give the credit to capitalism. There are a lot of things involved in this. Many people give the credit to Christianity, more specifically to the Protestant Reformation, and the degree to which Protestantism was able to work closely with the ideas of capitalism, and how people were able to put their new economic priorities in sync with their religious priorities under Christianity. Thereby, they were able to enlist the blessings of God in their pursuit of wealth. And the combination of these kinds of things made it possible for the West to continue on its ongoing pursuit of wealth, and at the same time to rationalize it and justify it with Scripture, with religion. Not only that, but Western civilization, in its interactions with non-Western peoples throughout the world, was able to rationalize and justify its expansion by suggesting that what they were doing was expanding civilization and expanding the Word of God, bringing the Word of God to those that didn't have it. So suddenly we have a whole new philosophical range of justifications for what we're doing in the world, why we're doing it, and why we cannot allow those people who disagree with us and our priorities to prevail. The result is that Western civilization develops inherently an innate sense of aggressiveness. And it is launching that aggressiveness upon a world which is not aggressive, which has not undergone the kinds of changes that have happened in the West. Therefore, the inevitable domination of the world by the West from this time onward is an important part of the conclusion. Why is this important in an American history class? Because the emergence of what becomes the United States of America is the direct product of this process. It is not something new and totally different from the world that gave rise to it. It is indeed a way of life that takes shape across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, is committed to the values, the goals, and the ideals of the old world, but is also colored, if you will, with a mission of improving on these things for the benefit of mankind. In other words, being able to bring to the world and bring to mankind the kind of lifestyle and value system which makes it possible for all people to prosper and flourish in this new world. And that becomes the philosophical justification that continues to propel us forward. Seems to me that students need to understand this. And that's really what I'm trying to do in the first week or week and a half, if you will, of a new semester. We've gone beyond the top of the hour, and I do apologize for that. But I really do believe this message is important. I think it's significant. For those of you who realize that you probably knew all of this stuff before today, I hope you will understand that my goal was not to insult your intelligence, but try to weave together an awful lot of different pieces of information from a lot of different perspectives, in order to create something that we can get our arms around and begin to understand. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break here as we move towards the bottom of our second hour. Here in West Virginia, that means that supposedly the height of the coming eclipse is supposed to be around 2:30 Eastern Time this afternoon. So I'm guessing that around the bottom of, in the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to undergo some darkness here. I don't know what that might mean in terms of our ability to connect, but we're going to operate on the assumption that it'll have no impact at all. So I hope you'll stay with us as we take a short break. It'll only be 4 or 5 minutes. I ask your indulgence and your patience, and I want to thank you for your continued support, not only of the Virtual Center, but of the Head On Radio Network that makes it possible to bring these programs to you on a regular basis. Thank you. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to the Virtual Center on this August 21st, the day of the eclipse. And during our short break, I stepped out into our front yard. My wife and granddaughter are out there, and they have a pair of those glasses that you're supposed to have to look at it, and they insisted that I take a look. It is phenomenal. It is, according to what the TV says, right now the total eclipse is over Carbondale, Illinois, and in the next 15 to 20 minutes it's going to be here, maybe less than that. And when I looked through the glasses, it looked to be about 60% of the sun was covered. And it's a phenomenal experience. And my wife was saying that the granddaughter can't understand why I'm not getting excited. And my wife said it's something to do with age. But it's really not. I'm very, very skeptical of the danger of looking at it because my eyes aren't very good anyway. And so I'm a little bit gun shy of the whole experience. But I know that in the next 10 to 12 minutes, we're going to get very dark here. And I'm assuming that this isn't going to have any material effect on our ability to broadcast. Thank you for those of you who have stayed with us and have been with us since the beginning of our program today. I thank you for staying with us here in the second hour. And for those of you who might be just joining us, maybe in parts of the country where the focus of the eclipse has indeed passed you and now is heading toward us, I thank you for joining us. I do remind you that we do have a phone number, and we look forward to hearing from you on some of these matters. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me in an email, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And again, I do call your attention to our Facebook page, and that's what we spent the bulk of our first hour on today. Were things that I have put on the Facebook page related to the class I'm teaching. And what I did in the last half hour before our break is to cover some of the transition elements of the transition from medieval to modern Europe in order to try to lay the groundwork for the period of exploration and colonization to come. What I wasn't able to cover, as many of you know, are things like the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, humanism, the Renaissance, the philosophical justifications, and the elements of the scientific advances necessary in this period to make it all work. The improvement of the abilities of ships to sail and know they can get back, know that they can keep track of where they're going. As seamen become much more adept at charting their course on the high seas, the ships become much more seaworthy, And all of that is a significant part of this whole story. The application of science and the improvement, the ability to bring technological advances to the needs of the age, which is a traditional definition of technology throughout the history of man on the face of this earth. And again, the philosophical and religious justifications for all of this that are tied up in the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, the challenge to Catholicism, the challenge to the control of man's understanding of the way the universe worked in the medieval period, and how Copernicus, Galileo, and the others were able to overturn these given accepted worldviews on which the Catholic Church's entire worldview and justification for its own existence and power were based. And Protestantism challenges all of that. And as we know, the Catholic Church makes an effort to engage in what the textbooks or the history books refer to as the Counter-Reformation in order to challenge or to counter the increasing spread of Protestantism. And we have the unfolding of a series of religious wars and religious conflicts, which the world hasn't quite gotten over yet. And, one of the major factors beginning in medieval Europe is the Crusades and the efforts of armies under the leadership and the tutelage of the popes marching into Middle Europe, the so-called middle portion of Europe, in order to free from the Middle East, free the so-called elements or aspects of the Holy Land, the holy places, from the control of Muslims, what those Christians referred to as infidels. And the religious wars which become the Crusades expose the emerging capitalism of the West to the wealth and the riches of the East, and make it desirable to get there and to gain access to some of that wealth. And that kind of feeds into the whole transition process into the modern world. These are the kinds of frame questions. I put together a couple of questions that I put on these what I call study questions for students, which help students, I hope, to try to frame the issues and get some semblance of organization and interrelationships between these things. Here's a couple of the questions that I've asked students to think about. Think about issues related to the transition from medieval to modern Europe. Each area of emphasis: political, economic, cultural, philosophical, scientific, as well as the specifics, the details within each area. Do you see how the details in each category interconnect? Do you see also how the different categories themselves seem to connect to each other? Political with economic, economic with philosophical, etc., etc. Why did all these things have to happen before the new nations of Europe became interested in overseas exploration and colonies? Another way to ask the same question: explain the process historians call modernization. What factors important in the process of development inspired Western nations to colonize the New World? What specific advantages did the West have in this process? Why did these nations become rivals in that process? What was at stake for each of them? Does it make some sense that history since this time has focused on various efforts to tone down the rivalries, increase the levels of cooperation? While nations are competitors, Are there important aspects of this process that they all have in common? Of course, what this speaks to are emerging efforts to organize, stabilize, and manage on an international basis the competition for wealth that this whole modernization system has unleashed on the world. It gave us, for example, after World War II, the United Nations. After World War I, it gave us the League of Nations. It produced a number of efforts in the 19th century among European nations to find a way to organize, to unite, to get together and form leagues of friendship. The idea being that if we can all find ways to cooperate, we can all benefit from this process. But if we compete with each other and ultimately end up fighting with each other, none of us win. And so that becomes part of the whole process. Here's yet another question that calls for consideration from the very same information. Quote, almost from the beginning, it appears, what we define as the modern period seems always to feature Western domination of the world and control of most of its resources, unquote. Does your reading support or refute that statement? Many people disagree with this. Can you speculate on ways they would take issue with it? How would you challenge that particular system? Yet another question on the same material. Quote, if you had to rank the issues connected to modernization from most to least important on a basis of 1 to 10, what would be your top 3 and why? Defend your choices. Basically, what I'm saying to students is for our purposes in this course, if you can get your arms around this material and make sense out of it, you have achieved a significant objective in the first unit of this course. Of course, there are more. There's much more. But this foundation, it seems to me, is critical because it becomes the basis of understanding foreign policies, understanding the origins of war, understanding the ingredients of peace treaties and efforts to end wars, and on and on and on. So these foundational understandings, if you will, become critical. As I mentioned the last time we were together, which was last Wednesday, I shared with you a couple of things. I'm trying to get some ideas down on the issue of the founders. More specifically, the issues of establishing Republican government and making it work. One of the things that fascinates me more than anything else, I think it's eclipse time because it's getting very dark here in my study as I broadcast. So I'm actually going to have to put on a few lights, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. One of the things that I'm trying to do and is put down, at this point, it seems to me important. If I've got anything to contribute, I need to try to find ways to get it all down. I think that very honestly, one of the reasons that I've been so excited for so long about the Virtual Center itself is because here we are halfway through our 4th year of broadcasting live programs here at the Virtual Center. And all the programs are archived. And what that means is there's a whole record of things that we've talked about over the months and years that we've been on the air, which I think will obviously live well beyond me. I'm kind of, you kind of become a little bit more cognizant of your own vulnerability, as it were, when you have a weekend like this one in which we lost both Dick Gregory and Jerry Lewis. Those are 2 people that have been around my whole life. from the time that these people first made their appearance on television. They were a major portion of my life, as I know they were yours. And now they're no longer with us. So I think it sends a message to all of us that this doesn't go on forever. What it's doing is motivate me to try to get some of these ideas down. And what I did on Wednesday, if you can remember back that far, is to share with you a couple of examples from my own writing on things that I didn't realize until I actually started to put it down. One of them, the last thing we talked about on Wednesday, was the role of John Lansing and Robert Yates as part of the New York delegation at the Constitutional Convention. And more specifically, the notes of that convention taken by Robert Yates that he refused to publish because he had taken an oath that the meetings and conversations and speeches that occurred within the convention would stay there and not be brought beyond the walls, the four walls of the convention hall. And Yates stuck to his principles and didn't make available the notes he had of some of the most controversial, volatile speeches delivered at the Constitutional Convention. Given the fact that I think reality tells us that the Constitution only passed the New York ratifying convention by a few votes, one has to believe that if Yates had chosen to publish his minutes, publish his notes, it likely would have had a devastating effect on the Constitution's passage in the state of New York. Ditto for the state of Virginia in June of 1788. Two of the biggest states in the Union, New York and Virginia, both of them extremely close, both of them seriously questioned as to whether the Constitution would pass. In Virginia, it caused James Madison to change his position and agree to support a Bill of Rights in return for a ratification vote in Virginia. In New York, even though Yates and Lansing took prominent roles in opposing the Constitution's ratification in the convention, Yates never produced the notes that would have sealed the defeat of the Constitution there. Consequently, the Federalist Papers that were appearing throughout in the newspapers, written for the most part by Hamilton, and significant contribution of James Madison, and a much less so of a contribution from John Jay, were able to carry the day in New York by a relatively few votes. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal story, it seems to me. I wanted to share with you yet another aspect of that story, not that particular story about Yates, but other aspects of this effort to establish a republic and at the same time stabilize the political situation in America by jettisoning the Articles of Confederation and replacing it with the Constitution of the United States. And what that meant was that in order to have a chance that the Constitution would be ratified, Madison and the other supporters of the Constitution had to make the case that the Constitution remained true to the principles of Republican government. And what happens as a result is a definition of republicanism in America emerges from the ratification struggle that ultimately shifts or changes the priorities of the meaning of Republican government significantly. Madison, Hamilton, and the others are able successfully to defend the Constitution of the United States as remaining true to the principles of republicanism, even though the concept, the principle of Republican government changed in the process. Anti-Federalists were never able to mount the kind of opposition that their case seems to suggest they could have mounted. And the meaning of republicanism changed from a situation explained in The Spirit of the Laws by Montesquieu, where the people called the shots and told their elected representatives what to do, in the classic definition of a Republican government, into an approach to republicanism which primarily focused on the election of representatives themselves, but election of representatives in larger constituencies, which meant that instead of making it possible for a majority of the people to get together and instruct their elected representatives, under the Constitution and the larger sphere in which elections were to take place, Madison was able to create a situation where there were so many factions, minority factions, competing for power, that the reality and the existence of a majority faction became what Madison believed to be impossible. The result being that decision-making shifted from the people instructing representatives to representatives making the decisions and then justifying those decisions to their constituents. The change is significant. I think the campaign to get it through was brilliant. And I think the founders need to be given credit for their accomplishments in this kind of a situation. What becomes clear to me as I try to get these ideas down in a way which makes some sense is to realize that the age in which these men lived seemed to dictate a definition of republicanism which was agreed to by advocates of the Constitution. There's enough evidence of agreement, first on the need for Republican government, but more importantly on a revised definition of that Republican government, that you can find evidence in the writings of Madison and Jefferson and Benjamin Rush, and interestingly enough, John Adams, which suggests that all of them bought into a basic definition of education, which we have come to call civic education. The thesis or the theme here seems to be as follows. Republican government was a given. The only way the Constitution of the United States could ever be approved and supported was only if people really believed that republicanism was alive and well. That meant that these gentlemen had to come up with a way to redefine republicanism, to justify the process of popular participation in choosing representatives on the one hand, but allowing the representatives to make the final decisions on the other hand. And what I've been able to do is find enough evidence that Jefferson and Madison and John Adams and Benjamin Rush, other leading spokesmen for the Constitution and this revised definition of republicanism, were in tune. They all seem to look at republicanism in the same way. We've already looked at it in Jefferson because we looked some time ago here at the Virtual Center on Jefferson's general diffusion of knowledge proposal to educate all young people, the masses, for 3 years in public schools funded by the state or funded by the local communities themselves. Education was public because it was paid for with public money. But it was available not just to the rich, to children of the wealthy, but to all children. Because Jefferson believed that in order to sustain republicanism, you had to educate young people into becoming good citizens in a Republican political system. And that meant you had to educate children, train them, if you will, in what a good citizen in a republic must believe and must do in order to fulfill his political responsibilities. Jefferson, if you remember, said that the education during these first 3 years, which was the only formal education that the masses of children coming from poor homes would ever get. Chances are, with the exception of the boy of best genius in each school, who would be pulled out and educated further at public expense, Jefferson's position was, after 3 years, for the rest of them, their formal education was over. Theoretically, then, these schools had 3 years to make Republican citizenship operative among children of the masses. That meant to Jefferson that the curriculum had to focus principally on history. Not English, not reading, not writing, not math, not science, not foreign languages, but history. Why? Why was the first 3 years of mandatory education in Jefferson's program devoted to the teaching of history? Jefferson says this in his proposal. History, by apprising them, the children, of the past, will enable them to judge of the future. It will avail them of the experiences of other times and other nations. It will qualify them as judges of the actions and designs of men, It will enable them to know ambition under every disguise it may assume, and knowing it, to defeat its views. Every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people alone. The people themselves, therefore, are its only safe depositories. And to render even them safe, their minds must be improved to a certain degree. Notice, their minds must be improved to a certain degree. Not educated to the full extent that their minds are capable of being educated. Only to a certain degree. Children, Jefferson seemed to believe, the masses of children during the first 3 years of mandatory education, are being educated. They are not being educated sufficiently to make decisions, but they are being educated sufficiently to follow the lead of those who are qualified to make the decisions. This is what I've said after that quote. It would be intellectually dishonest of me to not draw attention to the most significant qualifier to what seemed to be Jefferson's full faith in the people's ability to hold their elected officials accountable. His plan to educate the masses glossed over what remains a most troubling question. Exactly how would access to the ballot alone keep elected representatives honest? Jefferson's disturbing answer to that question. The influence over government, Jefferson said, must be shared among all the people. If every individual which composes their mass participates of the ultimate authority, government will be safe. Because corrupting the whole mass will exceed any private resources of wealth, and public ones cannot be provided but by the levies on the people. What Jefferson is saying here, despite what most of us wished he said, is not that our democracy will be sustained by a well-informed, well-educated citizenry. Quite the contrary. Jefferson must have known that only 3 years of formal instruction, that at a very early age, was a far cry from the kind of quality education implied. Indeed, to move past traditional elitism, when every important decision was reserved for the few, in large measure was what independence was all about. Jefferson's proposal for universal education presupposed a general population woefully unprepared for the kind of analytical rigor and mature judgment needed to evaluate candidates effectively. If we know that, we must believe that Jefferson did as well. Consequently, we must conclude that his objectives must have differed significantly from ours. The only way that the masses could realistically meet Jefferson's call to be, quote, judges of designing ambitious men would be to respond to a curriculum that was carefully scripted, to be taught literally how to know who's naughty and who's nice. What the plan depended on to deliver the accountability he promised, pure and simple, were the numbers. Jefferson did not believe it was possible for anyone to buy off the entire electorate, however attractive the prospect, however persuasive the messenger. Most people, trained to look for the right qualities in candidates, would likely resist an effort to promote the wrong ones. So much for why it's important that we all vote. Of course, today, there's this little matter of Citizens United, where the well-heeled can buy all the numbers they need. The critical differences between Jefferson's idea of a republic and our own are revealed here. Clearly a man of his time, Jefferson, like Madison, believed an education to sustain the republic must be tailored not to equip the masses to make major political decisions, but prepare them to recognize in candidates the qualities of character they were taught to trust as guides for casting their ballots. Think about that. To Jefferson, what education for the masses had to be was not the avenue to inclusion in the mainstream of society, but education which would forever dictate that these people remained followers of the leaders, participants, but followers. The only requirement to make it all work was that the participation had to be so large. Everybody had to vote. Because only by doing that could you prevent the wealthy and the powerful from controlling the way people voted. If everybody went to the polls, there was no way for the few to control what happened there. But as we know, that faith that Jefferson had in the power of numbers has come to a very crashing end. And I think Citizens United kind of is the explanation point on the whole thing. Just after the Constitution was ratified in late 1788, in January of 1789, after the first elections for Congress have taken place, before Washington is inaugurated and the government begins, January of 1789, Jefferson writes Richard Price and acknowledges his astonishment that so many Americans in so many different states had bought into the idea of consolidating government in order to create, quote, a federal government which could walk on its own legs, unquote. In other words, a federal government which was free of state control. In other words, the Articles of Confederation was gone. It was history. To Jefferson, that so many understood the problem and acted accordingly was proof to him, quote, that wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. That whenever things get so far wrong as to attract their notice, they can be relied on to set things right. Jefferson is somewhat amazed that the Constitution got through, that so many people bought into the arguments of the Federalists. To him, what it proved more than anything else was that when the situation becomes serious, you can rely on the people to set things right. And they did by ratifying the Constitution. Benjamin Rush in 1792 agrees almost 100% with this very unique definition of Republican government that Jefferson has laid out for us. In his Mode of Education Proper in a Republic, Benjamin Rush agreed that the principal beneficiary of public education for the masses must be not the individual student, but the state, the community at large. Our schools, Rush says, must make clear, quote, that the student does not belong to himself, but that he's public property. By producing one uniform system of education, Rush explained, our schools will render the masses of the people more homogeneous and thereby fit them more easily for uniform and peaceable government. His goal, Rush says, to create little Republican machines. So these people have adopted a very unique definition of Republican government to fit the situation, a situation which will preserve undisturbed the existing class system. The only way that you can get the Constitution of the United States through is if you have a republic, but are able to turn that republic into something that will work without disturbing the status quo, without disturbing the ability of the few to call the shots. The only change that republicanism does, in Madison's view of the Constitution, in Jefferson's view of the Constitution, and now in Benjamin Rush's view of the Constitution, is use education to prepare the young to make this whole system work, so that republicanism changes from power to participation only. We've only got 5 minutes left in today's program. The next person that I'd like to bring on board here is John Adams. In 1776, early January 1776, 7 months before the Declaration of Independence, 6 months, John Adams received a request from the Provincial Congress in North Carolina to share with them his ideas on a constitution if indeed independence happened, which it does in July. Adams responds to that request from North Carolina by putting down on paper his ideas for establishing a republic in America, in what he calls his Thoughts on Government. And in it, he adopts the same community-centered approach to civic education as being necessary in a republic. Adams quotes the poet Alexander Pope, to defend his plan for a republic that will be based more on quality of administration than on either its structure or its process. This is what he takes from Alexander Pope. The forms of government let fools contest. That which is best administered is best. Apropos of the period, Adams knew that a republic, however constructed, would live or die on the trust and support of its own citizens. He wrote, quote, "The foundation of every government is some principle or passion in the minds of the people. The noblest principles and most generous affections in our nature have the fairest chance to support the noblest and most generous models of government. And then Adams goes on to suggest that what we've got to do is find a way to educate the masses in order to elect the best people to be their representatives. And the way to make sure that republicanism works is to require that these people, these representatives, run for re-election annually every year. As Adams writes, like bubbles on the sea of matter born, they rise, they break, and to that sea return. How to make all this happen? Adams says, quote, laws for the liberal education of our youth, especially of the lower class of people, are so extremely wise and useful that to a humane and generous mind, no expense for this purpose would be thought extravagant. Once again, mandatory instruction in how best to choose those who will lead. That's the common theme of the founders. A system of education designed specifically to make Republican government work without disturbing the realities of the existing class system. It's not until the 19th century, until the influx of immigrants into America's major cities and the emergence of a larger and larger portion of the population that does not have access to land ownership, that brings Madison to the realization that we've got to get away from property ownership as the basis for citizenship. Only those who own property could vote. Madison's argument is, in order to make republicanism continue to work in a nation that is changing rapidly, we've got to find a solution, a substitute for property in order to connect people to our political system. Madison believes that the right to vote itself, if sold properly, can be that vehicle. And republicanism, as we know it, adopts its final chapter, if you will, which is universal education, in order to meet the need for universal participation in government as the only way to sustain a republic in a society in which larger and larger numbers of people do not have access to property ownership and likely never will have, because they work for a salary. They are not independent entrepreneurs. It's one heck of a story, it seems to me. It's an important story. It's one that hasn't been told. It's one that I've taken on the responsibility of trying to tell. We've gone a little bit beyond the top of the hour, but actually it took us 6 minutes to start today, so maybe we're a little bit even. I want to thank you for tuning in today to the Virtual Center. I hope that you've experienced and enjoyed the eclipse such as it is in your area, or that you will enjoy it if you're in an area where it has yet to happen. I invite you to join us again tomorrow for the Virtual Center live. I remind you that on Tuesdays we begin our program 30 minutes later, 1:30 p.m. in the East. I invite you to join us. Thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center, for your support of Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks at Head On Radio Network. I encourage you to keep this independent, progressive voice on the air, and I thank you for doing it for so long. For Bob and Agnes and the rest, this is Bill O'Brien thanking you so very much. Have a great day. Love each other. And we'll get back together again tomorrow. Thank you.